gonna, I guess, like start with a quick introduction. So for those that don't know, my name's Donald Raab. And as you saw, my Twitter handle actually is the Don Raab on Twitter. And they got myself and Skip McCormick here today. So a little bit about myself. So I am a Java champion. I'm also the creator of the open source Java collections framework called Eclipse Collections. A regular speaker at different conferences like Java One, Code One, DevNexus, QCon New York. Also, you know, for my day job, I'm a managing director and the head of Java platform engineering at BNY Mellon. And I'm very happy and excited to, you know, be able to be here today to, you know, co-present with Skip McCormick, who, you know, I'm going to give a little bit of introduction to him. So Skip is the co-author of a great book that I read back in the 90s. And I keep the book right near me at all times. Skip has this too. But Skip, you got the book, but do you have the signature from the author?
I can make my own.
Okay. So yeah, so it was a great book that you wrote. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I just want to share a little bit. You know, it was a great discovery I made one day at work, talking with Skip, who actually we work in the same area in architecture and data, and you know, just at his desk one day, you know, shooting the breeze, you know, rifling through the books that are on his desk, and I'm a book junkie, and I discovered the AntiPatterns book on his desk and started saying how much I love the book and love the different patterns and whatnot. And you'll hear a bit about this throughout the talk. So it was a, you know, very I would say great thing back in my 20s when I discovered the book in you know, the mid to, it was actually, I guess, the late 90s. And you know, as I'm talking to Skip though at his desk, you know, mentioning like, hey, there are these author names, and I'm like, you know, I think it was like Skip Mowbray or, you know, Thomas McCormick, and he's looking at me shaking his head. And like, I had no idea, like he was actually one of the co-authors. So he finally told me. You know, it was extremely exciting, and we had talked, you know, for a while about, you know, co-presenting on this, and it's really something that I thought would be amazing to bring to the community. Right? It's one of what I view as a classic, you know, technical book, and everybody knows, you know, the Gang of Four design patterns book, and, you know, books like the Pragmatic Programmer or Extreme Programming Explained. And AntiPatterns for me fits into that category of books that really just, you know, are amazing, so impactful, and like stand the test of time. So you know, we're going to, I guess I'll give a little bit of introduction. I'm going to get to the slide where, you know, Skip can talk about, you know, at length about his experience as the author, but we have like a little agenda here. We're going to talk about what anti-patterns are, the concepts, the root causes. We're going to go through at least the names of all the patterns that are in the catalog, and go through a couple anti-pattern and mini anti-pattern selections, and then just have an open discussion and Q&A. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Skip, who can tell us a bit about, you know, this great thing that he created so many years ago now. So.
Hi, guys. Thanks for inviting me out. This is super fun. When Don asked me to do this once already, it was like a blast from the past, and I really enjoyed it. So it brought back a lot of great memories. Back in the late 90s, I was a young systems engineer at a company called MITRE, which is there's offices in the Boston area and down in DC, and it's a well-known company in the DoD and military world. And it was a great opportunity for me as a young engineer to get a job at a company like that. But I remember during the interview for the job, the guy who was interviewing me, we finished the interview, and he said, "Do you have any questions for me?" And I honestly didn't think I was going to get the job because I felt way underqualified. So I just asked him what I really wanted to know. His name was Ron Zahavi. He's a co-author of the Corba books. And I said, well, what are like the things you did to get to where you are at MITRE? And he was sort of taken back. And I think I even said to say, what do I do to get your job? I think is how I asked it. And he said, well, at MITRE, you got to run a high profile project, you need to host a conference and you need to write a book. And I was like, cool, thanks. And so that became sort of my internal OKRs, right? I said, okay, I need to. They hired me for a high profile project, so that was good. And then we got pretty far along, and I was able to host a conference on it. I still needed to write a book, and so I was at a OOPSLA or Object World conference. It was one of those two, and um, uh, I was hunting for what I was going to write about, and I sat in one of these sessions by this guy named Mike Aykroyd, who's he's sort of a hippie. He wore jeans that I don't think he'd ever washed, and he kind of had long, unkempt hair, but he was sort of a programming god. Everybody knew who he was. He was just kind of odd, and his session was kind of counterculture on design patterns. Design patterns was a big deal. Been out about a year and a half, and he said, well, you know what? The design patterns are these things that that we should repeat. Like when you have this problem, here's the pattern that you should use to solve it. And he was really the creator of the AntiPatterns idea. He said, I spend a lot of time fixing things that are broken, and I'm finding patterns in the broken things. And so he did a deck on, I don't know, 2 or 3 what he called anti-patterns, which were bad solutions that you had to refactor into good solutions. The session was awesome, and the patterns were killer, right? And so after the session was over, I went up and talked to him and said, hey, this was really, really cool. Have you thought about writing a book? And he said, yeah, a lot of people say I should write this in a book. And I said, well, why haven't you? And he said, well, I don't really have the time to do it. I said, well, I'll write it with you, and I'll do all the work. And he said, really? I said, sure. It needs to be in a book. And he's like, okay. So I'm like, cool, I got my book. So then I went practically right from that session out to the conference floor with all of the booths. And at the Wiley Publishing booth, there's this lady there who I just thought worked at the booth. I didn't know. And I'm just talking to her and I'm looking at the books, and she says they're trying to build their computer science sort of a library. And I said, well, I'm just talking to Mike Aykroyd. I think I'm going to write a book on anti-pattern. She said, oh, that would be a great book. Can we publish it? And I was like, okay, sure. So we exchanged information. And I'm like, cool, I already have a book and a publisher. So I went back home and I was talking to Tom Mowbray, who was a senior fellow at MITRE and a previous author. And I was telling him about the idea. He says, oh, that'd be really great. And so we everything looked good. And the publisher called me and said, hey, how's it going? We should get a contract going. And I said, well, I haven't heard back from Mike Aykroyd yet. I've emailed him a couple of times, but I haven't heard back. And she said, okay, well, we really want to do this, so let us know. And so like a couple of weeks went by and I never heard from Mike. So I went to Tom, who knew him, and I said, Tom, Mike isn't returning my emails or calls. What can you help me reach him? And he said, oh, he does that. He sort of just checks out and nobody knows where he is. And he's gone for a few months. He's kind of, he just goes out into the, woods. And, I was like, oh, this is not good. And I told Tom why, and he said, well, we don't need him. Let's just write it ourselves. And I was like, really? And he said, sure. And so he and I put this team together of the upstart gang of 4, they called us. And we just started outlining the book and writing, and we committed to, we started a book club, and we would meet every Thursday night at this bar a block away from MITRE, and where they had darts, and we would drink beer and throw darts. And at every week, one person would present one book for everybody else, right? And we that's how we crashed through all of the material that we needed to crash through to be able to write this book. And so it was a team of maybe 7 or 8 of us that met every Thursday for several months. And then every Saturday morning at I think at 9 a.m. we met at Bill Brown's house, and we exchanged chapters, and we would say, okay, here's our outline, and each of us would take an anti-pattern, we'd start writing it, and then the next week we'd show up and exchange them to edit them. And it was a great way to do it, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm super lazy. And if I didn't have that Saturday morning commitment where I was going to go meet these guys who I respected, I would have slipped because I would say, oh, I'm too busy, it's Friday, I'm late. But as it would be Friday, I would get home from work and it's like 8, and I'm like, oh crap, I didn't do my. So I'd work till like 1 o'clock in the morning, so I wasn't embarrassed on Saturday morning. Get up, drag my butt over to Bill's house, and then we would do this. I didn't find out till later that all the other authors did the same thing. It was just, but that was the commitment. The book ended up being really good. And every one of us feels like we weren't the author of any particular thing, because every one of us wrote every part of it many times over. And then when we sent the chapters into Wiley, it was Hudson, Lisa Hudson, I think, was the editor. She really shredded our writing too, and brought in some other excellent writers. So we had basically, it was a group effort, and a lot of people helped us put it together, and it just came out. It just came out super fun. So that's, if you're thinking about writing a book, that's a way to get it done. If you don't have the kind of self-discipline it needs to force yourself to work on it, you know, a certain amount every week, get into a group with 4 other people who you respect, and make some commitments. It took us a year.
I would just, I guess, like say, you know, Skip, and you've heard this before, but I think, you know, good for folks to hear. When I first read the book, I was working in IBM Global Services. And, you know, I had the Gang of 4 book, and I was, you know, doing object-oriented programming and Smalltalk, and I was learning about patterns and object-oriented design and all this stuff. But I was also encountering the inevitable, you know, issues that you encounter in organizations, right? And, you know, when this book came out, I was like reading through it, just page after page, like reading and like laughing hilariously that, wow, you know, I thought I was in this unique position, you know, experiencing these things that I'm experiencing. And it was like, you know, very cathartic to know that there were others in the world. That this was actually, you know, patterns, and you could identify, and like you could actually come up with solutions to these patterns and refactor them. So but with that, I think I'll switch, you know, we'll go to, if you could talk a bit about the contexts, like
Sure. There was
sorry.
the thing about the Gang of 4 design patterns was their pattern language, right? And that made a big difference. And it was sort of the timeless way of conveying wisdom without having to provide code. It was pictures, and it made sense, right? We loved the formal language of design patterns and the rigor of it. And so we wanted to follow that forward with AntiPatterns. We said, you know what, there needs to be a formal template, and we need to force ourselves to have the rigor. And so there's a couple things there. One is the AntiPattern is really just a design pattern where the solution, the obvious solution, is actually worse than the problem, right? So like a design pattern, you have a problem and these forces, and you get to a solution. With an AntiPattern, you like get to a solution that's the AntiPattern solution, and then you understand the forces and you refactor it to a better solution. And we said, and we had lots of examples of that. We had enough examples that we made ourselves this rule: for each anti-pattern we would dare to write, we had to have at least 3 examples in 3 different contexts, right? And so that was a full anti-pattern. And then, so that took our initial list of, I don't know how many we had, maybe 50 or 60 that we thought were great. We got down to whatever ended up in the book, but there was a few other ones that we were like, this one's really good, but we just don't have 3 examples, or we don't know the solution. You had to have a refactored solution that has actually worked. It can't just be a good idea. And so those ones became mini patterns. And so the book has a few mini anti-patterns in where it's just like, this is fun, and it's clever, and it's entertaining, and it's real, but we didn't have 3 examples, or the refactored solution wasn't particularly good. Now that said, there's a couple of refactored solutions that are kind of dubious, like the corn cob anti-pattern, which you read, is really just about a jerk that you have to work with. And the only refactored solution that we had used that actually worked was, we called it the corn cob support group, where you take all the jerks and you put them together on the same project, and then one at a time they all come back to you and complain about everybody else on the project, and that's your chance to tell them, yeah, you fit in really well with those other guys, that's why we put you together, and then you have a chance to fix it. But if you're working for a corn cob, you can't do that. And so the solution was to fix your resume and find a new job. Not a great solution, but it was the right answer. So there's a few like that are kind of weak, but they're very popular anti-patterns. And I'll just finish by saying this: we got lots of feedback from various nerds around the globe who would come up and say things like, you know what, I was in my job at work, things were terrible, the boss didn't understand what was going wrong, and I read your book and I saw, we're doing this anti-pattern, holy crap. And then I took the book to my boss and I highlighted all of the bad things that were about to happen. I said, boss, I don't know, but it looks like we're doing this anti-pattern, and these are all the bad things that are going to happen. And here's a refactored solution. What do you think? And the boss would come back and say, yeah, we're changing, and they would fix stuff, right? And it's like, we knew the answer, but we didn't have the authority. We had to point to a book written by some guy who we never met to convince our boss that this was an anti-pattern. So I've ranted long enough, but
I think that's
back
probably a
to
good
you, Donald.
segue then to the root causes, right? Which
Yeah,
I think are great. So, want to talk a bit about this? Like,
yeah, sure. When we're writing these, you tend to write about bad things that happened, and you want to talk about the jerks that made it happen, right? It's human nature. We were at a company where we would be writing about our peers, and in some cases our bosses. If we did that, I probably would have not been career enhancing. And so what we ended up doing, so you know what? Let's make the forces. Let's say, this. Let's just assume that everybody involved in this, there's no villains, it's just all victims, right? And let's just assume that even the people who seem to be doing the wrong thing aren't doing it because they want the company to fail or the software to fail or any of these things. What's really going on is some other force that's causing them to act this way. And so I think it was Raphael who said, oh, it's like the 7 deadly sins. And we're all like, huh, you know what? That's great, because it was created by a pope, 500 years ago or something. It's not, we don't have to defend it. It's like, yeah, these are the 7 deadly sins. Everybody knows what they are. The internet really wasn't a big thing yet then, but we could find all of these. And so we said, as we looked at them, we said, you know what? These really are the forces that cause these things to go bad. And as we started assigning the forces to each of the anti-patterns, it actually gave us a handle on it. And some of the feedback was, we love that we can fix the problem without having to tell people they suck. Instead, we can just say, you know what, you're caught. We are rushing on this project. Haste is a force here, and it's causing us to do this anti-pattern. Or we don't understand the problem enough. We are narrow-minded. Or we don't really care enough about this customer. We have apathy going on. Or there's some people on the team who are just lazy, slobs, and they're not documenting properly, or they're not sharing, or they're not following the ontology or the libraries, right? All these kind of things. When you get to the pride one, it's a little bit, well, what do you mean? We got pride in it. Well, it does kick in, and it's usually the build versus buy decision. Like, we made this and we want to use it, and it's like, yeah, but word processors, you can just buy them now, and we should, right? So these 7 deadly sins came in really handy for taking all of the blame for the anti-pattern off of some person, so you could actually get busy solving the problem and give the people a pass to say, look, everybody here is just trying to do the right thing, and even if people are doing the wrong thing, it's not because they want to fail, it's because of one of these deadly sins.
and I remember,
So it worked out. Go ahead, Don.
yeah, I remember when I read the book, like reading the whole chapter on the root causes was just a lot of fun. I think, equating to, once again, identifying the problem, not like, not blaming the person specifically, right? It's like, what are these things that actually cause things to happen? That was like just a great start to the book, and like, kept me going then into, reading the individual patterns, right? So, and I think, that gets us to, this slide, which I would, before you start to talk about them, I just love hearing you talk about it. One of the greatest things I found in the book was just the names, and naming is like one of the hardest problems in computer science. And the real cool thing about the names of the patterns, like they draw you in, right? They're like really like a clickbait would be the modern term, right? It's like, you
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
find out, like, what is this funny thing? What is a golden hammer? Like, oh, I have to read about that, right?
yep.
Or a Swiss Army knife, or well, as you said, corn cob. It's interesting. What could a corn cob be, right? It's like a odd sounding thing, right? So each of these things by themselves, just the name kind of like drew you in, and really got you interested, right? So yeah, it was like clickbait, 22 years ago, before we had clickbait, right? So but I'll hand it off to you to talk
No,
about these
thanks,
things. Yeah.
Don. The names, we fought over that because a couple of the authors wanted to be more professional sounding, but we all decided that it was just presumptuous. We see, what, these names are fun, and we want to give the anti-pattern a pejorative name, like it's something bad. So if someone says, "Hey, dude, this looks like you got the blob going on here," and they say, "What's that?" and you could take them to the book and say, this is supposed to be object oriented, but all of your variables and methods are all in one object, right? So you're really doing structured programming inside of an object, and they go, oh, is that wrong? And you could just point them to the book and say, yeah, you're losing all the advantages of object orientation. Or spaghetti code. That's a classic one. We didn't invent it. We just said, let's define it. Let's create the language. So when we're talking about code that's calling itself back and forth, and you can't untangle it once it's done, let's just give it that name. One of the resulting criticisms we got in the reviews was a few people gave us 1 star and said, this is just common sense written down, as if that's a critique. But we read that and we're like, well, thank you.
Yeah,
that was
win.
one of our goals. So it's, can we give these things a label that everybody can use from now on? And you'll see some in there. Who hasn't talked about analysis paralysis or design by committee or vendor lock-in? This we didn't invent the terms. They were in some cases used, but we just sort of standardized what does it mean, and that was kind of fun. And like you said, Don, it made writing a little bit more fun too. And doing the graphics, doing the art was fun as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because unlike, I think one thing I would differentiate like design patterns and anti-patterns, the books, design patterns, like you can really look at it when you read the first 3 chapters and you understand the concept of design patterns and I apply. When you read the individual ones, it's very dry reading, right? And you look at it as
it's
like,
good. It's solid
good.
gold.
It's just it's nice reference material, right? Once you learn it, but like I've read these patterns like over and over again. They're just fun, right? It's like, and I love the anecdotes that you have on, each of the individual things, like the different quotes that you'll apply to the different anti-patterns and mini anti-patterns. It's like, oh yeah, I've actually, heard that said, right? So it's, good stuff. And I think, and this is everything, that's in the book, right? Both the anti-patterns and mini anti-patterns. So, and I looked at the mini anti-patterns when I first encountered them. They were like Easter eggs, kind of like at the end of an anti-pattern. It's like, oh, there's this extra bonus material I get to like learn about, right? And I think they're like a little bit less well formed than structurally than the anti-patterns themselves. But once again,
we didn't have enough to make it full.
Yeah, but it was like still really, really good reading, and and we'll I guess go into a few of our examples, right? So there were some good ones that jump out at me, and it's funny because we have on this slide two one anti-pattern, one mini anti-pattern, and these are this is the actual visualization from the book itself. And for the lava flow anti-pattern, the thing is, like, you don't have to put all the text here. You can kind of get the idea right from the picture itself, right? And even though you look at the picture and it's kind of funny, it's very dated, right? In terms of the things that are being called out, most developers nowadays won't know what DDE is, which is dynamic data exchange. They might not know OLE, right? Object linking and embedding. You probably know these things if you did any Windows 3.1 programming, or 3.0, or 1.0 or 2.0, right? But these things have, and the idea with lava flow is things start out hot when they get introduced on a project, right? But over time they like kind of like harden and solidify, and then like they're not the hot thing anymore, but you still like wind up with them hardened in your system, right? And there are approaches you have to take to and can take in terms of when lava flows develop, and this just naturally happens, right? And Skip and I have talked a bit about this. If you look this in more modern times, right? I would say like the most recent thing I would say, look at JavaScript frameworks, right? Imagine like at the top you had XJS, and maybe like a little bit further down you had Backbone.js, and maybe you could like add Angular 1, and then maybe like React and Vue and Angular 2 and Angular 4, right? And like each of these things were the hot thing at some point, but now it's like they're hardened in the system and people have to maintain and deal with it. So, but I'll hand it off to you, Skip. Anything you want to say about lava flow? Or?
No, it's true. At one of the things that we frequently did at MITRE was really expensive. And so they didn't really bring us in until the project was in real trouble. And so we would show up and we would have to debug a ton of old hardened basalt code. And you would actually go through code and you would see giant sections that were commented out, right? It's like all this code, and the code's still loading, right? There's just comments at the beginning and the end, and it says, I'm not sure what this does, but when we took it out, the program crashed and we didn't have time to sort it, right? And so So it's left in, it's still loading, it's using resources, it still gets compiled, and there's a whole bunch of, the sort of a modern example would be Java JavaScript in a web page, where I see a lot of guys, they have this whole library of JavaScript stuff that they load for every page. So it's all handy when they want to use some of the pieces. And then every page takes a long time to load because all of that code is loaded every time, even though it's not necessary. It's like it's a lava flow. And so in the refactored solution, we give a strategy for how do you take these things, identify them, and take them out. And sometimes it's just not possible. Usually when you're debugging, you're in a freaking hurry because there's some crisis and you were called in to fix it. And so we just said, you know what, we could give this a name, call it lava flow. We have some strategies for dealing with it. And just by giving it a name, sometimes that was enough to motivate the client to say, yeah, you have a bunch of hardened code here that's being loaded and it's wasting resources, and we can't figure out what it does. And the people who wrote it aren't at the company anymore. And a lot of times it's structural things that people wrote to set up a framework that isn't even used, right? I think maybe even a lot of products have that. Remember the Microsoft Foundation libraries?
Yeah, and I remember there was like things like, remember IBM had the San Francisco libraries, if anybody can remember those.
Classic.
Whatever happened to those, right? They're probably in use somewhere. Some poor person's having to maintain it, but
I
yeah, so I guess
I was talking to the CTO at Facebook, I don't know, about probably 6 or 7 years ago, and he said when they bring new people in to Facebook to code, they start them out, they have a boot camp. In the first 3 months on the job, they put you on a debugging team. Before you've done anything, they don't even know what you're good at. You're on the debugging team and you're just fixing problems. They said then they can watch how good they are fixing things, and that helps them decide where they should put them, right? And then when they put them on, after that first 3 months, they put them on one of the development teams, and they're still in their boot camp. And then finally they graduate and they're a regular developer at Facebook. And Facebook's like famous for all their A/B testing and all this other stuff. But what a lot of people don't know is they had these internal wars for how quickly a page could load, right? And so there was a constant fight to get rid of all of the lava flow in any given page. These guys would be able to write pages really quick, but there's this giant library, and then they had to go in once the page was done and winnow out all the things that actually weren't needed for that page to load so it could load more quickly. I mean, they had a lot of other tricks too, but that was one of the things. I remember talking to the CTO of Facebook, and he's talking about the lava flow anti-pattern, and he had no idea that I was one of the co-authors of it. So that's
well, and you drew the picture as well, right? This is your picture.
Yeah. I did all the graphics because everybody else drew some things, but I had CorelDRAW, so I could make digital versions.
Yeah. And I think the real general lesson here for all developers as well is like all code that we write is legacy, right? The day that you write it, it may not feel like it, but as soon as it is in production, it's legacy, right? Someone's going to be sitting there maintaining it, and it's going to get out of date and have to be kept up to date. And I think that's just something that we're all experiencing again and again in terms of like, how do we keep our systems soft so they can actually be changed on over time. And I think this is where a lot, and I think probably back in when the book was originally written, some of the development processes like test-driven development were just becoming, I would say, like well-known in the industry, right? And even like you can fast forward like 22 years, there's still a lot of people who don't write tests, right? And it's like tests are the kinds of things that when you have good testing around your system, you can actually make changes to it, right? And keep the software soft, right? But I guess on the other part of the slide here, one of my favorite in the anti-patterns, intellectual violence, right? And you can see the solutions here, and like people using obscure references to esoteric papers, theories, standards for intimidation and short-term gain. Like in financial services, this is like and I think in other large corporate environments as well. Like it's the TLAs, right? 3-letter acronyms that people assume that everybody knows what these things are, right? And you'll typically like, if you're lucky, you'll have some glossary you can go to understand like the terminology that's actually being used, right? And really, you know, the refactored solution here, you know, encouraging education and mentoring and coaching and organization is so important, right? You can't assume in any context that you know, someone knows something, and when you use a term, you know, being conscious that you know, and some people can do it, you know, purposefully, right? They use a term as if they're a master of it and they want to impress the people in the room. That's the negative
Yes.
side, but you can use it, you know, unintentionally, like, hey, I didn't think that maybe everybody didn't know what this thing meant, right? And you know, what I try and do myself, and you know, because I've, I guess, known about this anti-pattern for so long, the way I use it with myself is like, I try and be the one in the room that says, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you explain it to me, right?
Right.
I need help. I don't get it, right? Um, so, and I think that probably, you know, helps a lot of other people as well that maybe didn't want to step up and say like, you know, I just don't get this. I don't understand the thing you're talking about, right? So, and you know, that takes some amount of courage. And like, you know, I'm far enough in my career, I don't, you know, care that I, you know, look like an idiot
It
or
takes
I'm ignorant,
some
right? I'm
finesse.
ignorant. I have tons of
It takes
ignorance, and I'm willing to put it on display, right? So,
it takes
um,
some finesse too, because sometimes the people who are using the intellectual arsenic don't really know it themselves, and you can ask them to divine things, and they're kind of like humming, humming, humming.
yeah, can you teach me
So
about this? And then they're like, and that, yeah, that is the moment, right? You really know something when you can teach it. And if you can't teach it,
yeah,
then yeah, maybe you were just, you know, using something to sound impressive.
exactly.
um, and you know, it's funny because we've used the example before, and this is something, you know, I'm conscious of, right? You know, I carry the title of Java champion, right? And you know, when folks hear the term Java champion, a lot of different things can go through their mind, right? And you know, I'm just a human being. You know, everybody's read the book, you know, everybody poops, right? It's like,
Yeah,
you know, I've got, you know, strengths, weaknesses, right? I do have a title that I've earned, right? And I basically look at to myself, and I think other Java champions do this as well. We want to explain, you know, what this title means and what it means to be part of this community. And you know, it's an exclusive group, but you know, there's things that we do, and it's not like, you know, I just know when you get a, you know, a Java stack trace and a debugger, I can solve all your problems. No, the Java ecosystem is enormous. I can't know
yeah,
all things. There are things that I do know. There are things that I don't. And there are things that I do. But so I take a, you know, make it a point, because I also see other people use, let's say, the term Java champion. And when it's used, I want to make sure that people understand what this is, because yeah, I am not, you know, your Java help desk. Every problem that you ever have, I'm going to know every single framework and every
yeah.
problem. So, you know, I like to clarify that, right? And I think, you know, that is, you know, important. So, but any last thoughts on intellectual violence, or we go to the next one?
Let's do it.
Okay. Oop, went too far. All right, the blob. You want to talk about the blob?
Yeah, yeah. The blob was kind of the first anti-pattern we wrote, and it was we really inherited it from Michael Ackroyd's anti-pattern. He had one called the Winnebago, and I don't know if you know what a Winnebago is. It was a big thing when I was a kid. It's this giant van that has it's like a drivable camper, right? They have them now, but they're not called Winnebagos. They're I don't know. They have new names, but anyways, um, the Winnebago idea was that everything is rolled up in one object, and you're programming like a structured programmer, but and you don't you lose all the advantage of all of the object orientedness and the agility that that gives you and the inheritance. And so the blob anti-pattern um, was our extension of the Winnebago anti-pattern. We got some help on this. There's a guy named Skip Foote who was at Champaign Urbana who wrote an anti-pattern called Big Ball of Mud. And when our first galleys of this,
That wasn't Brian Foot.
Brian Foote, yeah, Brian Foote,
Okay, I was
and
gonna say.
you're right, right. And it was the Big Ball of Mud had a lot in common with the anti-pattern. So we talked with Brian, and we referenced each other's material. But it's so common that you know, the point of the blob, we were sort of calling our science fiction roots with the movie The Blob, and then that great version came out with Kurt Russell, where the blob actually was eating everything around it, and if you touched it, it infected you. And so that was the idea. And the refactored solution for this goes into a lot of detail about how you should think if you're building object-oriented systems and you're actually building methods with local inherited data. And so it's a good anti-pattern for just explaining object-oriented thinking.
And I think, these are kind of things like we still see it today, right? And I think, probably like crossing sometimes anti-patterns in some ways, like we'll see God objects in systems, right? People do
Yes.
structural programming, but then you'll see sometimes a combination of like, this large pile of code, but then just all over the place control, right? Which I guess probably winds up more into the spaghetti code, right? It's like there's really no overwhelming design sense to a system, right? So I've seen combinations of these things in practice. But
I'm just
once
looking
again, I
at our
guess,
picture here, and
what was
I'm
that?
realizing how dated this is. Looking at the picture with a CRT on the screen.
Brings back the memories.
Yeah.
Well, you can imagine too, if you still got a CRT lying around, there's probably some blob waiting to come out of it, right?
Yes. Yes.
Some chemical process that happened or something. But yeah, so interesting question. Like, I just love the name, right? The mini anti-pattern of Wolf's ticket. Like, what is Wolf ticket? What is that?
Well, so the concept of wolf ticket is, it comes sort of, it's like from scalping and the sure thing. It's like, if you do this, you're golden, right? And so there's this idea that if you use Java beans, that's going to solve all your problems. It's a wolf ticket, right? Without even knowing what you're trying to do. If you use this tool, if you this happens a lot in data science. They talk about the platform. They say, yeah, use Cloudera Data Science Workgroup, or use Domino Data Lab, or use this. And I always want to say, wait a minute, what are you trying to do, right? It's like, are you picking the tool before you understand the problem,
Yeah,
right?
I was gonna say it's a solution looking for a problem, right?
Yeah. And this was really prevalent back then, and it's still prevalent today. The solution here is you actually need to challenge that. You need to don't assume that just because this product is made by this company, it's golden, right? That's a good starting point, right? But there's some of the best products come out of nowhere, right? And it basically requires you have to grow up and do your homework, and
Yep.
so that's kind of the story there.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're. How are we doing on time? 6:48. We
Yeah,
got like a open Q&A and discussion if we want.
yeah. We have until 7:30, but
All right, we got lots of time
Good,
for
good.
questions. Then we
Well, in
can
that
get
case,
into all sorts of discussion.
yeah, let's do it. It'll be fun.
All right, so I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll do this real quick. Just at the beginning of the deck, there were two links. So antipatterns.com is, I guess, the site originally for the book. There's another site too that actually has the detail of each of the individual anti-patterns as well. So it's sourcemaking.com/antipatterns. So if you want to check, both those out, you can. I think you can still get the book for folks that are interested, probably in Amazon or somewhere else. There's no Kindle version though, right?
There isn't. The publisher wanted us to do an updated version, and we can never get all four of the authors together. We just were all too busy. So it just hasn't happened. I'm thinking that it should be time. It's overtime to do that, but it's going to need a lot of work because we have to update all the references. So I'm in the process of a new anti-patterns book. We wrote two more after this that were focused on source code management and on project management. They were interesting books, but very small audiences, and they weren't anywhere as near as funny, right? So they're just not entertaining reads. Sort of like M. Night Shyamalan movies. The first couple were really good, but then he ran out of ideas, but had plenty of money to make a few more, right? But since then, I've been working on some new anti-patterns because I encountered them, and that's just how I think. When I see something, I say, oh, I've seen that before, and I give it a name. And so I have a couple open here that the names might sort of trigger you guys. One I call centralized disservices, and this is so prevalent at the bank where there's a bunch of different groups that are kind of doing the same thing, and somebody says, well, this isn't very efficient, we should bring them all together, and that makes a lot of sense. But then you bring them together, and then the new thing that's together starts to define what it will deliver, and it stops being useful. But everybody's paying for it, and you're not allowed to get something different, right? It's kind of like you join a homeowners association, and they decide that they don't want 14 different trash companies coming on every day of the week. Let's do one contract for one trash company, and we'll get the best price, and then it only is on Tuesdays. And everybody says that's a great idea. And then it happens, they pick the lowest bidder, and then that trash company can't really do the job at the price they want it for, so they sell their contract to another trash company that wouldn't have won, that does a terrible job, and that sends everybody a note that says, we're no longer picking up leaves, and we're no longer doing this and that. So after 2 years of this great deal, everybody's driving to the dump to take their own trash to the dump, and they can't get rid of this company, and they're not allowed to hire another one because they have the power of the centralized disservices. So that's a non-programming example. So I think this anti-pattern, we have a good solid 3 examples. The only problem is I don't have a refactored solution. I've experienced this over and over and over again, and I've never been able to solve it. So I can't write the anti-pattern unless I can tell somebody how to fix it. And the only way I've seen it fixed is sort of the same solution as you have with corncob, is you just fire the people who are forcing us to do this stupid thing. So, or you replace it with another centralized disservice. So that centralized disservice is central planning one. 2 others I'll talk about. One is I'm experiencing now in droves, and I call it slow is slower. And this is the case where you're trying to do something and somebody says, well, wait a minute, let's stop and think about this for a minute. And that seems reasonable. The problem is if you stop and think about it, you give a whole bunch of other delays time to catch you. And so you thought you were going to delay 2 weeks while you thought about it, but now you're behind 2 months. The last one I'll talk about is where is it? Oh, potty training, right? So the potty training anti-pattern, and it's a great name, isn't it? Is this idea that
visuals are already going off.
yeah, you made something. We invested a year of time, and we wrote some product or capability or service, and we made it, and we have this big investment, and now we're looking at it and we're realizing, you know what, there's a new product out that does what we just wrote that's better, that we could just buy. And you're like, yeah, but we've invested so much in this and we love it. And what you really need to do is flush it and shift to the new product. And the potty training analogy comes from my mother told me when I was a kid and I was being potty trained. The first time I made a poopy in the toilet, I was so proud of it. And everybody came in and congratulated me like, oh, good job, little boy, and all that. And then my dad flushed it and I burst into tears because he flushed away my poopy. I was so proud of it. I don't remember this. I was really little. But that's the analogy for this code. It's like, oh, great, you made this thing. It's wonderful. You're very proud of it, but it's a turd. Flush it away and buy the better product, right? And so I love that anti-pattern just because of the visualization. And
Right.
and once you have that language in place and you're in a meeting with executives and they're arguing about build versus buy when you should buy, you can just say, I think this is a poopy, we should flush. And everybody who knows the potty training anti-pattern kind of goes, yeah, right? It's like takes the argument out of, we've invested so much and we should keep going to, yeah, you know what, it's a turd, flush it.
I think we have a question from.
Yeah, why don't we do questions?
Yeah, that was a lot of good information. I think Scott has a question.
Yeah, so I as a consultant, I look at a lot of bad code in my time. So I'm just curious, like, imagine you have, really disorganized, massive blob-like code base with numerous anti-patterns, it's barely readable. It's really hard to know at what point should you start over from scratch and basically throw away the code. Is trying to refactor that code in and of itself an anti-pattern? Like, if you're trying to put Band-Aids on a dam that's about to collapse, is that an anti-pattern? Or should you just start over? I know it's a loaded question, but I see that a lot.
It's an excellent question. And I think its example is Eisenhower said, planning is everything, but the plans are nothing. And in the sense of that is you go to the trouble of planning, which forces you to understand the context and the domain really well. But then once you encounter the enemy, it doesn't go the way you planned, and you just have to improvise. But you improvise better because of all the planning you did. You understand your resources, you understand your logistics. There's a lot of stuff you know, so you can actually improvise better. Another similar analogy is a football play. You see this with certain quarterbacks. I think we just watched one. It's like they have a play, everybody's supposed to do a certain thing, but when you fade back and the receiver isn't where he's supposed to be, you have to be able to scramble, right? And I think what you're talking about is you do the work. You recognize the anti-patterns or the collision of anti-patterns. They usually come in sequences. That happens a lot. If you understand the anti-patterns enough and you understand the design patterns enough, and you have the experience that clearly you have in consulting, you can judge and say, you know what, this play should be scrapped, and we should go back this far. Here's how far back we should go, and we should resume. And I think if you have the anti-patterns handy, that can help you make that argument. You can say, look, I got 3 anti-patterns going on here, and this isn't me talking. This is, look, I'm pointing at this book written by these guys, right, from more than 50 miles away, and look at the bad things that are about to happen because of these anti-patterns. And people go, whoa, that's really bad. And you say, we can try to refactor all these, or we could just go back to the point before that happened and do it properly. Maybe go back and say, we should have started with the right design pattern at the very beginning, and this is the right way to start. I love that idea. In fact, I'm going to steal it in the next book.
More questions?
If there ever is one.
Okay, I have a question from the presentation. Can you show
Where do
me?
you want me to go? Sure.
It was slide 5. 7 deadly sins.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So my question is, Evries, the modeling of excessive details, which results in excessive complexity due to insufficient abstraction. I wanted to understand, where do you draw that line? Like, this is too much detail or this is too less details? How do you, when do you know?
Well, the avarice deadly sin is about greed, right? And the idea here is that inappropriate decisions can be driven by the wrong reasons, right? So you might have a particular language that you know, and even though that's not the right language to use, you force it, or you have a design that you love, that is intellectually stimulating, but actually isn't as simple as it could be. You know, it's really where you're putting your needs ahead of the project's needs, right? That's kind of the whole point of greed, is like you're not really sharing. And in this case, you're not sharing the intellectual space. You're making decisions that suit you without considering the impact of those decisions across the board. It's in that space. The avarice one was kind of the 7 deadly sins, it was kind of the least least cited one.
Went forward. Sorry.
Did that answer your question, Nia?
Yes. I
Thanks.
think it's a lot of, I think I do that a lot. I also tend to do that a lot. And it helps when you are discussing with your teammates and, coming to a proper conclusion together to make that sound decision. You get too close to technology.
Thank you. I had never thought of that, but I've been accused of being a bully in meetings because I'm so sold on my idea and I want to force everybody to see things my way. And I realize that's exactly this. That's one of the deadly sins.
Right.
And I don't want to die. So I'm going to have to watch myself.
Yep, I have a question. This is Chandra. Hi. My question.
Hi, Chandra.
Hello. Given your experience outside of the financial industry, I mean, you've been in multiple sectors, and this is like a crowd of people who are not just in the finance, so they probably will be interested in this.
Good.
Is how do we how do you sort of derive more anti-patterns as as a part of your experience? Where did you come up with different scenarios, and do they apply across all industries in similar fashions, or do you see some niche changes happening in every industry?
I want to give Don a chance to go on that because he's in the software side, and he can answer from that standpoint. Coming out of like work my years at the CIA and other places that weren't finance, the simple answer is yes. I see these anti-patterns all over the place because there's people all over the place, and the 7 deadly sins are sort of tied to the people. Like I gave you the example for centralized disservices, I used a totally non-software example of homeowners association and the trash thing. They centralized disservices anti-pattern at CIA was a massive anti-pattern there, and that was where I was desperate to find a solution. CIA created a CIO, mostly because of, I think, Sarbanes-Oxley law. Everybody has to have a CIO after that. So they created a CIO, and then they rolled up all these IT groups from wherever they were into one place. And it was super, super frustrating because you couldn't get anything done quickly anymore. Everything had this gigantic process and governance and boards, and the people who gravitated towards that weren't necessarily the best at doing it. And so it was not a software problem. It was an organizational anti-pattern. So that's one example.
I think
if
probably
I'm following your question, Don.
I would say like I would assume like when you were writing the book originally and coming up with the anti-patterns, you were getting feedback from a lot of different places, right? Because there's only so many places you can work, right?
Yeah.
And you're seeing it maybe within the context of one place. I can tell you, like for myself, when I was reading the book, I saw these anti-patterns in healthcare, in
Yes.
in IBM. I saw it in an e-business consulting firm I worked in, right? And then I've seen them in financial services, right? And it's like these things, they just occur naturally, right? And it's the natural evolution of, like, I think humans having to solve problems, and the human aspect encountering the technical side of things, right?
Like you said earlier, we're all flawed.
Yeah, and I think understanding that these are the causes, right? It's not the people, right? It's not the individuals. It's the individuals responding to different situations. Maybe like we've got a deadline of next week and it's got to be done, right? You do whatever you can to get the software going, but then it's like you've got this other challenge of, well, now that it's in there, it's going to be in there for 25 years, right? And now what do we do after the fact that we're in prod, right? Because as soon as it's in prod, it's legacy, it's hardened. How do we, then it's gonna, so it's funny because like it may, if time is your pressure, there may be cost later on to, either readdress decision or whatever. If you never do that, right, then, you'll experience some other consequences maybe, right? Where, if you can't take the time to make sure like you understand the lifespan of your project, right? If it's going to be 6 months or 3 months, maybe like the work that you do is not so bad, it's throwaway. But a lot of times, like, and this happens across industries, you develop something and maybe it's like it's in prod for years, right? Or decades, right? And we all got to see this through COVID, right? With the COBOL program craze that happened when we need to actually write unemployment checks in New Jersey, right? And all of a sudden, like COBOL programmers are the hottest commodity that you can get a hold of to actually address the problem of, like, there's just this software that's been running for decades, and it needs to either run faster or cut more checks or whatever the new pressure that's on it, right? And how do you address that, right? So, and that was always one thing. I don't know if it fits into like it's definitely a force, right? It's like understanding the lifetime of your project is so important, right? Because if you don't understand that at the beginning, you're not going to be prepared. And I think the trouble in software development that we have is, like, most people don't have a what's the word for it, a view past, let's say, 6 months to a year for their involvement on a project, right? And having that view of like, hey, I'm willing to, whatever I'm going to do here, I'm going to maintain this for the next 10 to 12 to 15 years, right? Because if that was the case, right, you might have to optimize in certain cases for like the quick delivery, but you'll also be thinking like, what's going to make my, life easier and,
Right.
allow the software to change over that time period, right? And make sure that over that 10 to 12 years, if I'm going to stay on this problem, I'm still going to have to plan that I'm going to have new developers coming in, and how am I helping them come up to speed, right? And what are the things that I'm doing for there, right? And I think, there's probably strewn throughout all these anti-patterns, probably different solutions to this particular problem. But it's funny because I don't remember anything, and correct me if I'm wrong, Skip, anything in anti-patterns that specifically addresses that problem. It's like, how long is your system going to be around, right?
Yeah,
And can you nail that down, right?
it's an excellent context that I think there are some anti-patterns, and it's sort of like, it's like short-term thinking. There's probably a really rich material base there to write that anti-pattern. I remember, as you were talking, I remember very clearly, I was invited to a meeting. It was probably 2004. It must have been 2004. I was invited to a meeting with the CIO at the CIA, which was rare, right? I was just a pretty junior person on at the time, just a scientist working on a project. And they invited me in, and the meeting was to discuss the 2014 infrastructure, right? And I remember sitting in this meeting and go, that's like 10 years from now. How can you plan 10 years ahead? That's crazy. But the CIO of the agency was planning in detail for 10 years from now. And it was the infrastructure and the systems and the communications backbone and the software and all that. It was a big lesson for me. And I think it goes exactly to what you were saying, Don. I was a junior programmer at the time. Well, I wasn't even writing code. I was a scientist running a project, but I was thinking about the here and now. I needed this thing to work, next week. And the idea of worrying about something 10 years from in the future, just, my dad used to say that most kids don't appreciate history until they have something to put on the scales, right? And so that's it. The other thing that came up is, as you were talking about different industries, I did some consulting at Kaiser Permanente years ago, and I remember it was, they wanted me to help them use big data analytics. This is what data science used to be called, to help Kaiser do a better job. And everybody was assuming it would be, we're going to use essentially data science to help the doctors make better diagnoses, right? That was the golden hammer, right? The idea was the golden hammer. That was the obvious thing to use it for. And I remember going in and talking to a bunch of doctors, and every doctor was like, look, that's crazy. I'm in pus and blood for 8 hours a day, saving people's lives. And then at the end of the day, I wash up, and then I have to sit down and I have to respond to 50 emails from patients. And my day's already over and I'm exhausted. I just want to go home, right? And so, but I have to answer an email from Mrs. Jones, who's been self-diagnosing all day on WebMD and thinks she has bubonic plague. And I have to actually read through what she wrote, look up all these different sites that she's citing, and then I have to type her a careful note that says, Mrs. Jones, you do not have bubonic plague. You're fine. Or Mrs. Jones, go to the emergency room, right? Because she might. And so he has to take it seriously. And he said,
go to like Central Europe, like 17 or 16, whatever year it was.
But that was the golden hammer idea, was we're going to help the doctors be better doctors. And he said, no, I don't need help there. He said, fix my email problem. He said, if you can use your big data to read my emails all day long while I'm working, and then when I sit down, Mrs. Jones's email has already been parsed, and you've already looked up all the things she cited, and you've already generated 3 answers. One that says you don't have the plague, one that says you do have the plague, and one that says maybe you do, you should get this test, and then present me that to edit. So instead of me taking 45 minutes to reply to her, I can do it in 10 minutes. He said, if I understand your big data and your data analytics, that's the kind of thing you could help me do. And I remember being blown away and saying, I thought I was going to help people, help doctors save lives. And all I'm really doing is helping doctors get home at the end of the day. But it was a big thing. Everybody's like, whoa, if you could do that, suddenly all the doctors were in favor of it, where before they were like, get those computer nerds out of here. They can't help us. And so, like you said, Don, completely different context, completely different industry, but the golden hammer anti-pattern isn't necessarily about the code or the tool. It can also be about the idea.
And it just got me thinking. And Scott, I'm going to credit you for getting this whole conversation started.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We focus a lot in software development these days with various agile methodologies and Scrum practices and whatnot. And everybody, I think here, if you're a software developer, can appreciate like software estimation is hard, right? And getting our, let's say, cycles and sprints or iterations, whatever you want down to smaller, iterations, like
increments.
We focus on this idea that we can estimate better if our horizon of predictability is smaller, right? If I only have to predict out for the next 2 weeks, I can tell you more accurately how much I can actually get done. When I want to predict it out for the next 5 years, it's really, really hard, right? And it's going to be like, the horseshoes and hand grenades, style, right? But so I was just thinking like maybe a term for what we probably need to get to eventually in software is like a horizon of accountability, right? How long are you going to be willing to be accountable for the decisions that you make today, right?
Sort of like a Breyer score for your
because the thing is, like, when you're working in medicine, right? You've got a lot more pressure, right? Because it's life and death situations, right? For us, it's like, in software, maybe it's like monetary, right? Hopefully, some people do actually have to work in the life and death situations. I guess if you're programming, for airplanes or cars or, medical equipment, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
But by and large, like, just software for your, your website and other stuff, right? But once again, I think, I don't know, I'm tossing out this idea, horizon of accountability, right? And I lived through this myself, and to use myself as an example, when I worked in a former financial services firm, to be unnamed. I went through different roles in an area where I was like an architect on this project, and then maybe an architect over an area. And then I wound up as like CTO for, the entire, line of business and technology that I was working in. And basically, like, every decision I made in these individual areas, I was now owning the accountability for all of it, right? So yeah, I got to see, all of my decisions, over a 10-year period come to roost, right? And that became for me, like, as I was hiring new developers in, I would teach them, imagine that you have to own this problem for the next 10 years, right? It's like, how are you going to think about the things that you're doing, right? And, nowadays I would say, like, having things like, readmes for your project, as folks who work with me will hear me, go on and on about this, but really having, following, let's say, pragmatic programmer's tip of basically build your documentation in, don't bolt it on, right? Have your documentation be able to survive with the software, I like this whole idea that, the long term, the only thing that really survives is the source code, right? The people, the original team moves on, right? And this really gets to like the lava flow kind of, anti-pattern. It's like the teams move on, the people move on, but like the software keeps running, the source code stays around. You might lose the documentation. You might go through like 10 different wikis over time, right? Or different places to put stuff, right? So, having strategies that help you keep all the things that are necessary to keep the project alive, new teams coming in and being able to take over, having them able to do that, right? So to handle the, the new hire problem and, like, attrition that naturally happens, right? But you can keep, the software running to keep things alive and have new people be able to change the code that, former people wrote. And they can do that with confidence because you have, let's say, tests in place, right? And you've done all of these things.
You have a proper horizon of accountability. I think you're talking about the refactored solution to short-term thinking. We should collaborate on that, anti-pattern.
Can I volunteer something?
Sure.
Yeah.
So part of what made me think about the question, a little bit what you guys are talking about, is I was recently brought in, and I can't say too much, but I can give a little bit of details. But I was recently brought in to consult on a application written in BASIC that has millions of lines of source code, and has been in continuous development for 30 years by one developer.
Wow.
Wow.
And what's interesting, I mean, I could spend my lifetime studying that source code because, you know, he spent his lifetime writing it. But when I was looking through it, seeing to go through comments that, you know, I was 5 when they were written, or to read a string of comments that span decades. Like there's like 1994 wrote this, 1997 wrote this, 2012 wrote that. To see something like that, it's both beautiful and horrible at the same time.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's something to behold, and it's almost like something I wish we could just study because it tells a story in and of itself.
Well, Scott, you know, I can tell you from my own experiences, and you know, I think different folks that have you know, worked with me in open source or, you know, worked with me have seen this, right? You look at Eclipse collections, the code base is 17 years old now, right? And there's stuff, and you know, I was there at the beginning because I wrote like the first classes.
But was it written in BASIC?
No, it was written in Java 4, and then Java 5, and then 6, 7, 8. Now it's on 8, right? But the funny thing is,
it helped define those versions.
Yeah, the nice thing with, you know, something like Eclipse collections, I think this is probably different for the project you're on, right? We kept investing in the code and doing things that when it moved from being an internal system to being open source, right? We had to put in place things that would make it so that new developers could come in and add to the code base, which meant it had to be very well tested, right? We, you know, had done.
I imagine you refactored every few versions of Java if that's not it.
Well, we did major refactorings along the way, right? And you know, I've even talked about this at you know, Java 1. Like Java 5 was probably one of the biggest ones, and you know, the holdover from Java 5 lasted for years because like when you write a collections framework without generics and introduce generics, you have to learn a lot about generics, but then you have to, you know, spend a lot of time getting generics just right all over the place, right?
Yeah, writing generics. I can only imagine because I've only done it partially, but your method signatures are almost impossible to read and write, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, when you've got question mark supers and question mark extends, and like you got to make sure you get, you know, covariance and contravariance and all of these, you know, and I'm using intellectual violence now.
Oh no! I've seen the method signatures of some of those. They're really hard to write. I mean, they're really hard to read.
Yeah, well, it's funny because like, and this is a funny this is a funny anecdote about, you know, once again, lava flow, and I showed I think probably Suresh and Renat, I think both got to see this because I showed them the code recently. There is parallel eager utility classes in Eclipse collections, and they've been there since 2005. And some of the things that I did writing actual, and there was parallel code I was using for like real use cases, like I had real big data in memory, and I had the capability of leveraging multiple cores, and like we were solving you know, real world data parallels and problems back in 2005, right? And this was before there was Java util concurrent in Java, right? We were actually using the old Oswego library, and we were actually I started out using the fork join library when it was in the Oswego library, because fork join didn't make it into Java until Java 7, right? And we switched from fork join to executors, right? And then actually we reintroduced another parallel utility. I didn't actually show anybody this. It's called FJ iterate. It's actually got its own module, and it's dedicated to being like parallel iterate, which uses executors but only using fork join. And then later, if you look in the you know, executors library now, you can now say executors.new work stealing pool, which effectively just uses the fork join library, right? So I can look around and say like, well, FJ iterate, I might want to look at that as just a failed experiment of like, we don't need it anymore, right? And you can actually see this, and this is, you know, and this is a hard thing to do. And I'm going to, am I still sharing my screen?
You are sharing. I don't.
I'm going to show you this because it's, oops.
Don, right after this, we do have one person who wants to ask a question. So as soon as you show this, we'll ask Sahu to unmute and ask
Okay.
a question.
So I wrote a blog for New Year's and explained what I thought the next 5 years of Eclipse collections could look like, right? And the first thing I said is, what do we need to get rid of? What do I want to kill, right? And clean up, because you have to keep doing this, right? And this is, once again, revisiting these things that maybe they made a lot of sense when we did them, but like, we have a large code base and we want to keep evolving it. Like, we got to get rid of, I call them, you've got the anti-pattern of warm bodies. I call these dead bodies, right? It's like, what are the dead bodies we don't want to carry anymore? Do I really want to have JMH Scala
Zombies.
tests?
Yeah.
Right?
It's zombies just running around eating your brain.
Yeah, and like, doing things like moving slow running unit tests to acceptance tests, right? Like, for me, like, the most important thing when you're working in code is like having extremely quick feedback, right? I make a change and I say, do all my tests pass? Well, it means I want my tests to run in under a minute, or even faster than that if I can, right? It's like, because I'm wasting human time here, right? So, but that's like, that takes continual discipline to, keep that going. But the idea is like, if I want this project to survive for another 10, 15 years and get more and more contributors to it, right? I have to basically, similar to like if you want to have a long life, right? And I'm going to use myself as a bad example. Maybe go out and exercise and eat healthy, right? But you have to keep doing these things, right? So,
Yes.
but I'll stop yapping. Blog is out there if folks are curious. And I talk about, once again, different things we have to consider. We might not do all of this, right? The reality is like, you can't do everything that you want in life. You have to obey certain economic principles, and, maybe the cost is not worth it, right? Or maybe your cost in time is not worth it, right? It's like, I got other things I want to do in life, right? But at least write them down. Maybe someone can take them up, right? But it's something to, healthy, I think, to at least think about. So what was the question? I'm sorry, I'll stop yapping.
No, that was good. That's good to see all these different projects and how they've evolved in the last 17 years or so. I see one hand is raised, like Sahubut, is that right?
Yes. I'm Sahabut. I have to admit that I haven't read this book yet, but I think it's an interesting book, so I'll read it. And I saw that this book was written in the 90s, right? So my question is, do you want to update any part of the book or add something more regarding to new technology, new finding, new experience that you found?
I do. It's a question of finding the time to do it. And I think the other co-authors all would like to as well. But where we're leaning now is instead of just getting the four of us together, right? We're thinking maybe we open source this and we do it in a community where everybody can contribute to the updating the old patterns and adding some new patterns in some structure. And then instead of every Saturday for a year, what it could end up being is a lot more people collaborating. And what we're doing is really just enforcing the template to make sure that the rigor is there and making sure that the examples that, every anti-pattern really has 3 examples, and that the refactored solution is actually a demonstrated solution that has actually worked. So I think you're exactly right. And it should happen. It might not be us that does it. I mean, it doesn't have to be us.
Yeah, I think that's a great concept, right? It's like, and once again, that's looking further ahead, right? We all have and this is going to hopefully sound sad or whatever, like limited amount of time in the universe, right? That we have.
Yeah.
And it's nice if, other folks can take things forward, right?
Yeah.
Because
one of the authors of the design patterns, John Felicities, was a friend of mine. I remember when he passed away, it was like, wait a minute, you can't die. He's one of the legends, right? You know what I mean? It's like, yeah. When you go, you take all of that stuff that was in your head with you.
Yeah, that's actually something too, like where and I try and pass on this advice to others, like write down what you know. So I think, it was great that you wrote this stuff down with the other authors in 1998, but like, folks need to write down what they know, right? And pass that on, right? Yeah, because like we all get, sorry, a little sad and philosophical, but we all get limited time, right, on the planet.
Yep.
So, and it's funny because like I consider myself lucky. I consider myself lucky to have met you, Skip, right?
Well, thank you.
And have once again encountered
reciprocal.
Thank you. But
you're the
I've
only Java champion I know.
Well, you know, too, you got Chandra as well, and well, now you
I
you
know-
work with
I know
Nikhil
who
as well.
they
It's like
are.
Java champions all
Yeah.
around you. But no, I was gonna say, like, you know, I count myself fortunate, and you mentioned like you know, conferences like OOPSLA, but I look at, like, you know, the tough times that we're going through right now in pandemic times. It's still great that, like, we can all get together virtually and you know, meet folks you know, in person at a distance, right? But I count myself lucky that, you know, I got to go over, you know, the last 30 years of my career to like a bunch of different conferences like OOPSLA and Java One, and I've always sought out my heroes. And like, I'm, you know, a big book nerd. I'm always walking around with books at conferences trying to get them signed by the authors, right? And you know, I think
Me too.
it's I think it's a great opportunity when you can actually get in touch with the folks. And I think it was a great, you know, to have you here speaking tonight. And you know, I'm hoping we can you know, do this you know, do this again. I think it's so important too for developers that, you know, maybe have been working for the last 2, 3, or 5 years. They won't have heard of books like AntiPatterns, and I wouldn't be surprised folks haven't heard of, like, you know, some of the books I read in the 90s. Like the first book I ever read on object-oriented design was written by Rebecca Werfsbrock, and I remember I got to meet her at, you know, a dinner function at OOPSLA in 2002, and it was hilarious because, like, she was like the person who wrote the first book on object-oriented design I ever read, and I got to meet her, and I was like, you know, talking with her over, you know, beers and dinner with a bunch of my colleagues, and then out of nowhere, Yukihiro Matsumoto, I think I hopefully got the name right, walks out of you know, the blue to come up and wants to take a picture with Rebecca as well. Now he actually created the Ruby programming language, right? So I got to meet you know, Mats as well. I was like, it's like, this is amazing, right? And you know, my advice is always, like, if you get the opportunity, don't be shy, don't be afraid. You know, it's very flattering, I think, for authors, and you know, some folks don't want, you know, the human interaction, perhaps, right? But you know, I think a lot of folks are very you know, flattered to you know, get the positive feedback, and actually happy to have a quick conversation, right? About their work. So
well, thank you for inviting me, you guys. This was super fun. I had a good time, and if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a query or shoot Don a note. We'll do our best to answer them.
You can find me on Twitter. Do you have a Twitter account, Skip, or you don't use Twitter?
I never tweet. It's just, it was ingrained in me at CIA. I followed Twitter. I parsed billions of tweets. We used it very effectively, but I never actually posted one just because I knew what we did with them. So, you know, it's just, there you go.
It makes sense. It's I can understand and appreciate.
We'll redirect all queries to Don then.
Send them to me.
Send them to Don. But no, on a serious note, thank you so much. This is our first virtual event for this year. So we're really, really excited, firstly, to host the two of you, you know, but also making this extra special just to kickstart our, you know, events for this year. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, guys. Attended the sessions. Hopefully you guys can come to our next events as well through, you know, please register using Meetup, use our Twitter account, and you can, you know, follow us and get all the updates that you need. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Renat, did you want to add something?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
Yeah, nothing to add. Thank you everyone for a great session. And hopefully we see you next month.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.